Our guest this week on Veterans Chronicles is U.S. Army veteran and Korean War veteran and Vietnam War veteran Paul Roach. And sir, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for being here.
We're joining you here at the American Veterans Center Conference in 2017 in Washington, D.C. Let's start with your story. Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Las Cruces, New Mexico, about 90 years ago, and grew up there, went to high school, and as soon as I got out of high school, I registered for the draft in 1945, and got drafted right away. And 8 days later, the Japanese found out that I'd been drafted, so they quit.
That's the untold side of the end of World War II in the Pacific Theater. You always hear about the nukes, but not about their fear of you.
And then I spent about 10 months in the Army, and I had an appointment to the military academy. Went to West Point in 1946, graduated in 1950, class of 1950.
What was the most significant part of that experience for you?
Well, just getting through West Point, especially plebe year at West Point.
What was the toughest part about it?
Well, I think the toughest part was, as I said, plebe year. They give the plebes a pretty rough time. But after that was over, things were switched around, so I had the opportunity to give the plebes, the new plebes, time. Did
you have the instinct to go easy on them because they were tough on you, or did you relish the chance to dish it out on them?
Well, I was not a very tough upperclassman, but I was required to give them a little hard time.
Now, we spoke with one of your colleagues, Colonel Dow, a little bit earlier. Did you know him at West Point?
Yes, I knew him. We weren't very close, but I knew him.
Okay. And he was saying that, of course, he was in the same class as you, 1950. He was immediately deployed to Korea after that, after commencement. So was that the same for you?
Yes, it was. Mm-hmm.
And what unit were you assigned to?
I was assigned to the 9th Infantry Regiment of 2nd Infantry Division, which was already in Korea fighting.
When did you join them?
In late August of 1950.
And so was the push north already happening at that point?
No, we were still in the Pusan perimeter. And we spent about another month there, and then crossed the Nakhtong River. And the day that we crossed the Nakhtong River, our convoy got ambushed, and I was trying to find out what was going on, and I got shot in the leg. So at that time, they evacuated me back to Japan. Spent about a month there in the hospital and recuperating, and then came back to Korea.
You probably wish it had been a couple extra months in the hospital.
Yes, if it had been about 10 days later, my life would have been changed quite a bit.
Wow. Okay, so where was your unit when you rejoined it after being in Japan?
It was up in the northern part of North Korea, about 40 miles from the Chinese border, I guess. And I joined another company there, and I was with them for about 8 days before the Chinese really came into North Korea.
What happened with your unit when they came flooding over?
Well, we were furthest north of our division, I believe, and it was King Company, and I was a platoon leader at that time, and the night of the 24th of September 1950, the Chinese came down en masse, and never seen so many Chinese soldiers. But they said there was about a regiment that hit us that night, but I think it was about three regiments. My platoon was in the lower part of this mountain with the rest of the company, other than there was another platoon right with me near my platoon, and we fought all night off and on. And the next morning, early in the morning before it got light, I sent a soldier up to contact the company, and he came. He was there for quite a while, and this was a black soldier, and he came down disguised as a Korean with a Korean hat and a white coat, and he said, "Sir, there ain't nobody up there but Chinamen." And the company had been hit, and they scattered. I believe the company commander was captured for a while, but then he got away later. So we held them off for till about noon the next day, and I ran out of ammunition, and I was the only one firing at the time, so my assistant platoon sergeant was there with me. And I told him it was time for us to surrender, and he said, well, he was going to play dead. And I said, okay, good luck. And I stood up with my hands up, and a machine gun fired at me from the behind. So I got back down in my foxhole and waited a few minutes, and finally I just decided that was it. So I threw my weapon out and stood up again, and for seemed like about a minute nothing happened, and then the Chinese started rushing out of this ravine. And I was surprised. Most of them patted me on the back and were very happy to see me captured. There were a couple of them that weren't happy about it, and they gave me a couple of hits with the rifle butts. But anyway, that's when I got captured.
Wow. So what did they do to you then? Did they make you do a forced march?
First they moved me up with some other prisoners who had been captured, and I was the only one left in my platoon. The assistant platoon sergeant, I saw him later, and he had been captured also, but he died during his captivity, so I'm the only one from my platoon to come back.
So the one who played dead, that didn't work?
No, he was captured and died later in a prisoner of war camp. And they recognized that I was an officer, and they sort of separated me from everybody else. And for a while I was by myself. They moved me out of there for a couple of miles south of there. And then other soldiers, captured soldiers, began coming in with me. Then after a few days, more and more prisoners came in, and they separated the officers from the enlisted men. And there were about, I'd say about 20 officers in my group. But I found out later that the entire 2nd Division had been cut off during that action. And a lot of them were captured. In fact, there were about 2,000 of us POWs at that time. And the first few days we were separated, and then other people started coming in, and they moved us to some caves. And we were in these caves about 2 weeks. And we'd get 1 meal a day, and but at least the caves were a little bit warmer than it was on the outside. And after that, they moved the whole group. I think there were about 2,000 of us by that time. We went west over a big mountain range, and the weather was below zero, well below zero. I think it was the coldest winter that they'd had in North Korea.
Talk about that a little bit more, because I mean the temperatures are almost mind-boggling even for people who are used to pretty severe winters. And as I've read, and as the colonel told me earlier, it's not like you were dressed warmly. You had just thin prisoner clothes on, right?
That's correct. I had a field jacket on, which was similar to this coat. But having been back in Japan for a while, I had accumulated some long underwear, which helped me. But it was awful cold. And then they moved the whole group to the east over a mountain range. And I remember we would move only at night. It took about 3 days to get over this mountain range and into another area, an abandoned mining camp. And that was where everybody gathered, and they kept us there for about a little over a month. And by that time, people were dying from the cold, the cold weather. People were getting
malnutrition.
The wounded people, a lot of them were dying, and people were getting sick from drinking the polluted water and so forth. So in that camp, I think there were about 2,000 prisoners, and before we left in about 6 weeks, around 700 of them died. I found out later. Then after that, we all became very weak from lack of adequate food and the cold and so forth. But they moved us then north, and we went on up to the Yalu River, which was a border between South Korea or North Korea and the Chinese and China.
Sir, let me pause you right there. We'll pick up your story in just a moment. This is Veterans Chronicles. Welcome back to Veterans Chronicles on the Radio America Network. I'm Greg Corombos. We're here at the 2017 American Veterans Center Conference in Washington, and I'm honored to be joined by Korea and Vietnam veteran Paul Roach, who was also a prisoner of war in Korea, and that's what we've been discussing for the last several minutes heading into the break. And sir, go ahead and please continue your story.
At Pyeongtaung, it was designated Camp 5, POW Camp 5, and many of the prisoners were congregated there. There was still inadequate food. The weather was still below zero, and people still dying. Every day you'd see people that had been moved out, and the Chinese would come along and collect the bodies. But fortunately, I survived all of that. And after a few weeks, they began their indoctrination program. They were trying to indoctrinate us into their communist theories, and trying to convert us, I guess, into so that we'd be communists when we got out of there. But we have resisted that, and finally we just went along with them so they wouldn't harass us too much. And we'd have classes every day, and a Chinese officer or individual would get up and speak in Chinese for about 15 minutes, and then an interpreter would tell us what he said for about 5 minutes. And then in the afternoon, we would go back to our little huts, and we were supposed to discuss what we had heard that morning, what we had learned that morning, and take notes. And I was selected to be the monitor for my hut, my room. And in other words, my job was to sort of supervise the discussion. Well, we discussed the food we were going to eat when we got out of there. And I would designate somebody every day to take notes, not about what we were talking about, but what the Chinese had told us that morning, and quotes from everybody in the room. And if we had one man appointed to be a lookout, and if the Chinese were approaching, he'd let us know, and we'd all start talking about what we'd learned in the morning. And as soon as they left, we'd start talking about what kind of food we were going to have when we got out of there. And that went on for several months. Finally, when it started getting warmer, the Chinese furnished us with uniforms, lightweight uniforms, and for the summer. And that summer, things began to get better then in the springtime. And fewer people were dying at that time.
What was the toughest part for you? I mean, all of it is horrible. The indoctrination, I'm sure the beatings at times, the malnutrition, the sickness. What did you struggle with?
I think it was just the malnutrition. That I became very weak. Originally when we'd go out on a wood run, we'd pick up wood to bring back to burn to keep the stoves going, to cook the food and so forth. And I could carry a fair-sized log. But then as time went on, I could just pick up a little stick and barely carry it back to. So all of us were, with a few exceptions, were extremely weak. And then as the food got a little better, we started putting on a little weight. I think when I was captured, I weighed about 150 pounds. And at one time, somebody got hold of one of these levers that you weigh by, and we figured that I weighed about 85 pounds at that time. 85. And all of us were in the same, basically the same condition. But then when things got a little bit organized for the Chinese, we started getting better food, and it was all what we called koliang, which was a grain. We never got any meat, and occasionally we'd get a little fish in our diet, but not very often.
Mr. Roach, let me pause you right there one more time. When we come back, more on this amazing story with Paul Roach, veteran of Korea and Vietnam. Welcome back to Veterans Chronicles on the Radio America Network. We're at the 2017 American Veterans Center Conference in Washington, and right now we're joined by Paul Roach. He is a U.S. Army veteran of Korea and Vietnam. He's a West Point graduate, and as we've been discussing at length, he was also a prisoner of war for an extended period of time in Korea. And sir, as I mentioned the fact that we're at the conference, one of the reasons you're here, in addition to sharing your own very important story, is to honor Father Emil Kapaun. How did you first meet him, and what was his impact on you?
Well, the first day that we arrived at Camp 5, the first evening, they'd broken us down into groups, and we had about 25 people in one small room. And right after dark, there was a knock on the door, and we told whoever it was, come in, and he said, good evening, I'm Father Kapaun of the 8th Cavalry Regiment, and welcome to Camp 5. And he said, would anybody like to pray? And of course everybody wanted to pray. But Father Kapaun, after that, he would come about once a week and pray with us and tell us jokes that he had heard and cheer us up, try to cheer us up. And he'd do that about once or twice a week. And he was going around to everybody in that camp. At dark, he would sneak under the barbed wire and go into the enlisted group, enlisted compound, and do the same for them. He'd cheer us up, and try to cheer us up, and give us a little spiritual help. So I would see him, well, a couple of nights a week maybe. And then in the daytime during the classes, of course, he was required to attend also during the daytime. And that's the way we got to know him. Finally, we heard that he had died, or we knew he was getting very sick. And what he was doing was giving his food up to sick people and taking care of them. And he would he actually made a bowl so that he could boil water to drink and then to wash clothes for the sick people. And finally it got to him, and he passed away.
What was the impact on you personally from his selflessness as well as the unit even after he died?
We were all heartbroken when we learned that he had passed on. But at least he kept us going through the winter, or most of the winter. And the remembering him helped keep us going for the rest of the time there.
What was it like in terms of wondering if you were going to be freed or if the war was going to end soon?
Well, the rumors were spreading that the war was over, that there was a hospital ship down at the end of the river, and they were going to come up and take us down there at any minute now, but it went on and on and on. So finally, we got so we didn't believe anything.
When you realized you finally were going to be free, what was that like?
Well, the Chinese were going to make a big deal out of that. And we all decided, by that time the officers had moved to another camp, Camp Number 2, which was about 15 miles away from the Camp 5. And we decided that we were not going to show any emotion at all. So they lined us up, and they had cameras there and everything. And they were expecting big cheers and everything, and they told us that that the armistice had been signed and that we were going to go home. And there was complete silence. So we didn't give them the opportunity to let us cheer that we were going home. And then it was about 2 weeks later, they said that we were going to pack up, and a convoy of trucks pulled up, and we loaded all of our stuff, got on the trucks, and we sat there and waited. And after about an hour waiting in the trucks, they came back and said, there's been a storm and the road had been washed out, and so we weren't going to go that day. So we went back to our hooches, and the next day they loaded us back on the trucks, and we went on up to the railhead and got on train and came back.
I've heard from other folks who were prisoners of war that just before the release, they fed you much better, cleaned you up some, so it looked like they had treated you better, correct?
Oh yes, when the armistice was signed, they broke out all this food that they'd been hoarding. Canned meat and canned food from Argentina, and all this wonderful stuff, candy. And we gorged ourselves with that, and then when that ran out, we starved again for a little while on the way home. But we got on the train and came all the way down to Pamandjan, where the exchange was. And there they put us in another POW camp that was very rudimentary. Sleeping on the ground in tents. And they about starved us to death again down there before we were released. And they would release come in and read off a bunch of names, and they'd get into trucks and go down and be released. And about halfway through, I guess, they called my name and I was released.
When you've been without freedom for more than 2 years, what's it like to have it back?
Well, it was wonderful. We could hardly believe it. They took all our clothes and gave us GI uniforms, and it was really wonderful. And the first thing we had was a bowl of ice cream. that we hadn't had for almost 3 years.
That had to taste great. I've heard that there was also a special cross made in honor of Father Kapaun that was carried out. Is that?
Oh, yes. A Jewish officer who arrived at our camp after Father Kapaun had passed away heard so much about Father Kapaun that he made a knife out of the steel plate that in the bottom of our shoes. He found an old shoe, got the steel plate out of it, sharpened it up, made a knife, and he carved a cross using some of the baling wire, or the wire that was around our compound, and made this wonderful cross that was about 3 feet high, I think. And this was after Father Kapaun had died. The Jewish officer never met Father Kapaun, but he'd heard so much about him that he made the cross. And they kept it hidden for almost 2 years, and then when we got released, they carried it out.
When you see the difference now between North Korea and South Korea, what do you think?
Oh, it's wonderful. When we were released, when I came back from Japan after being wounded, I went through the capital of North Korea, Pyongyang, and the city was operating. The streetcars were moving and so forth, and there had been some damage, but you couldn't really see it. When we came back through on the way home, there was nothing there but rubble. And a lot of the rubble had been cleared away, and they'd planted gardens or fields, made fields there, and planted garden where there used to be buildings. And you look up on the mountainside all the way around on the hills around the town, and the people were living up there. The only thing in the city was one bridge across the river, and that could not support the train, so we had to get off the train, get into trucks. They took us across the river. We got on another train there and went back down to Panmunjom.
We only have a couple minutes left, but as I mentioned at the start of each segment, you also served in Vietnam. What was your role there?
I had 2 tours in Vietnam. The first tour, I was an advisor to the Vietnamese infantry school, tactical advisor. And then the second tour, I had come back and was sent to Fort Hood, and I became a battalion commander there. And right after I took over as a battalion commander, the regiment was formed, and my battalion was part of the 198th Infantry Regiment. So the 198th was designated to go back to Vietnam. And we moved back there, and I commanded the regiment for about 6 months in combat there around July.
How intense was that? How intense was that?
July was not, there was not too much action there. There was a lot of Viet Cong within the north Vietnamese army was scarce around there. So, but our mission was to, primary mission was to prevent the Viet Cong from rocketing the division headquarters.
And how long were you there? 2 tours, you said, each about a year?
Yes.
Okay. When did you retire from the service?
I retired in 1974, I think it was, and went back to New Mexico to my wife's sisters. Two of her sisters lived in the small town of Hillsboro, New Mexico, and that's where we moved and stayed there until the year 2000. Then we moved back to Las Cruces.
There's a great story from the end of the Korean War where you lost a bet in the best way possible because someone said that you were going to go home because you had been exchanging letters with your wife, and they said you'd be married within a certain amount of time, right?
That's right. Where'd you hear that story?
Oh, I do my research.
Yes, a friend of mine, when we were still prisoners, told me, I'll bet, I got a letter from Virginia, my wife, or my future wife, and he said, I'll bet you a fifth of whiskey that you get married within 6 months of when we get back. And I said, oh, I don't have any plans to do that. And within 2 months, we got married. So I lost a fifth of whiskey, and we got stationed near San Francisco, and I looked the guy up that he was stationed there, and I paid off his fifth of whiskey.
Good man. Best bet you ever lost, right?
So I hold that against my wife for the last 65 years or so.
I think that's a good bet to lose.
She cost me a fifth of whiskey.
Fantastic. Love to end on that note. Paul, thank you very much for your service, and thank you for your time with us today.
Thank you very much.
Paul Roach is a graduate of West Point. He is a U.S. Army veteran, served in Korea and Vietnam. I'm Greg Corumbus. This is Veterans Chronicles.